Jimmy Carter's great-great-grandfather, Wiley, had over 5,600 acres of land and nearly 30 slaves. In 1841, he shot and killed a man named Usry, a neighbor of his whose first name was never recorded. According to Wiley Carter, Usry stole one of his slaves and absconded back to his house. Wiley got the sheriff and a posse and went to Usry's home, where they saw him in the night lighting a lantern and loading a gun. Although he never actually fired a shot at the beginning of that standoff, he only shouted insults to Wiley's wife, accusing her of infidelity. The sheriff testified that both men raised their guns at the same time after hours of a tense standoff, but Wiley shot Usry in the right shoulder, a shot that would ultimately prove fatal. A few years later, he moved to Plains of Dura, later just Plains. It was the Carter family's flight to West Georgia that brought their clan to the area and set the course for future generations. Wiley's daughter Jane married a young man from the local community named Isaac Newton Hart Jr., who served as a private in C Company of the Sumter Artillery, one of Jimmy Carter's many relatives who wore the gray uniform of the Confederacy. He also became a reverend after the war, dying peacefully in 1900 at the age of 71. You can see here that the old Carter Cemetery was only restored in 1967, shortly before Jimmy would be elected governor of Georgia. And you can also see just how well they got established in the local community. They had 11 grandchildren, and the Carter family became incredibly popular and relatable because they seemed to have good relations with all of their neighbors in this local community. They left the past behind them in East Georgia and moved to the west. Once he'd been sufficiently settled in Plains, Wiley Carter had a son of his own in 1863 named Littleberry Walker Carter. Littleberry was Jimmy Carter's great-grandfather, and it was usually reported in family histories that he was killed with a case of diphtheria, followed by his wife only days later. However, it was later reported in newspapers and through a little bit of family folklore that Littleberry was murdered in a drunken row in a fight over a sort of homemade merry-go-round, and the son of the town marshal killed him, fled to South America, and was never seen again. What's so unusual about the graves here in the cemetery in Americus is that they were originally buried near the family farm. However, someone had bought up the farm and years later had built a pigsty right next to them, and the pigs were butting right up next to the graves. So when Jimmy Carter was a young man, he bought the plot, moved the family to Americus, and buried them in the shadow of the Confederate cemetery right over here. And Littleberry's son would have a fascinating story of his own. Littleberry Carter's son, Billy Carter, moved to Early County and became a businessman, quickly buying up 3 sawmills. No matter how well you ran those sawmills, you were likely to make a few enemies. This is also Jimmy Carter's paternal grandfather. He sent his 15-year-old son to go get a desk from a man he'd fired from the mill recently, but the man said he bought it fair and square and refused to turn it in. So the boy came back and told Billy Carter he said it was already paid for, and Bill said he'd go talk to the 2 men, because it wasn't just the man he fired. The man he fired was also staying with his brother. His son tagged along and saw as an argument escalated. These 2 brothers stabbed Billy Carter 7 times and shot him twice. The brothers were in fact acquitted, and the Carter family that lived around Rowena moved to Plains the following year, in around 1904. This kind of consolidated the branches of the Carter family around the area and pushed them more into agricultural business. And when I first saw this, I was kind of intending on setting it upright, but without supports and proper securing, I don't think I would want to do that just on the off chance it tips over and cracks. But that is Jimmy Carter's grandfather, and we are just in the shadow of the Cuthbert Water Tower. At the time of the move in 1904, Jimmy Carter's father, James Earl Carter, was only 10 years old. He grew up a little bit, but feeling restless, he joined the Army and became a lieutenant in the Great War. He returned back to Plains, dying in 1953, and Jimmy Carter came back from the military on a hardship discharge and took over the family business at the farm, right there in Plains. Jimmy Carter's old high school is just down the road here, and I thought I'd come to his hometown of Plains to show a little bit of his life that isn't that widely talked about. Because in 1953, after the death of his father, Jimmy Carter decided, like hundreds of thousands of other Americans, to take up public housing. He was the only U.S. president to do so, and during this time of economic hardship, he actually stayed here, and it reminds me a lot about his paternal grandfather, Uncle Jim, who was very interested in politics and would go to the Capitol and literally live in a rooming house just to bump shoulders with politicians. The Carter family lived and breathed politics. Jimmy Carter's life after he left the Navy in 1953 molded who he was as a person, making him the most relatable president, the most relatable person to ever hold that high office. He not only understood the need for social welfare programs, he's the only president to ever have to utilize them just to have a roof over his head. This is the Dura apartment complex, and he continued supporting them for the rest of his life. He even volunteered at local farms that were living collectivist lifestyles and based the Habitat for Humanity off them. And into her old age, his wife pioneered the cause of making these little butterfly sort of waypoints across the country. The man buried here actually inspired Jimmy Carter's interest in politics. It's Jimmy's paternal grandfather, James Jackson Gordy, also called Jimmy Jack, and in his later years, Uncle Jim. After moving to Richland, Georgia, he served as the 3rd District campaign manager for Tom Watson, an unusual politician I'll discuss shortly. Jim Jack never held elected office, but served as postmaster, federal prohibition agent, and would regularly travel to Atlanta to campaign for Tom Watson, living in a boarding house while he was there. In fact, he loved Tom Watson so much, as a self-styled agrarian rebel, he named his own son Tom Watson Gordy and let the man know in a letter to him. Watson wrote back saying he was honored. Alton Carter, Jimmy Carter's first cousin, told the press that Jimmy was fascinated by politics because of the passion that his grandpa, Jim Jack, had for it. Jack died in 1948, leaving a lasting impression on Jimmy Carter when he was a young man, having heard stories of his maternal grandfather sleeping on the floor to campaign for this agrarian reformer. His son, Tom Watson Gordy, would, like the other sons of Uncle Jack, embrace local politics. He served as a radio man in Guam, and when Japan occupied the island, they sent him to a prisoner of war camp. He survived, was brought home to fantastic applause and waving of flags, and lived for decades, a fixture on the community, only dying in 1975. Tom Watson, the politician, not Uncle Jim's son, began as a liberal in the 1880s, a voice of reason for rural people. Sadly, however, he gradually shifted further right, embracing white supremacy and anti-Catholic rhetoric, mostly because of Georgia's county unit voting system, which I'll detail in just a minute. His political career was influenced by boyhood heroes, Georgian Confederate politicians Robert Toombs and A.H. Stevens, who he thought provided a voice of reason for the otherwise headstrong Confederate government. As a very young man, Watson led local farmers' alliances. During Reconstruction, these alliances forcibly took land back from large corporations and gave it back to the farmers in an act of near rebellion. He was opposed to paper money and speculation on farm commodities, and famously demanded and achieved rural mail delivery. And the reason for his shift right was because of the county unit voting system. I said I'd go into that a little bit. Essentially, this was an informal system in the state of Georgia in which if you won a county in Georgia, you won a vote. So naturally, you wouldn't be appealing to the larger populace in the cities of Atlanta, Savannah, or Augusta. You would be appealing to the farmers. So although his policies of basically integration, land reform, and helping rural people through communalism and almost you could call it proto-socialism. I've read the communist politicians in Alabama actually writing quite favorably of him in the 1920s. He started to embrace whatever would stick to rural farming communities, which gradually shifted towards keeping down black farmers, tenant farmers, and just race baiting, basically. Very unfortunate, but he was a voice and a figure in the local community for decades. I just met an awesome guy in the local cemetery, Frank Taylor, who told me that this house on Broad Street in Richland is where Jimmy Carter's mother, Lillian, grew up with her father, James Gordy. It was James that inspired Jimmy Carter's interest in politics, and again, to see a humble home just outside of a town like this is beautiful. And I think it's pretty interesting because you can't really find much information about this house online, in spite of the fact that it was so crucial to Jimmy Carter's understanding of politics and the Southern people. Jimmy Carter's great-great-grandfather, Wiley, married Thomas Ansley's granddaughter, Anne. Born in 1798, Wiley was one of the very first white men to settle on what used to be Creek land, working around the community of Ellaville. The rock house in the middle of the community where Wiley met his wife is still standing. When Wiley died, he gifted his home to his favorite son, Abel Ansley Jr., who became a reverend in the later years of his life, and he is buried on the right. So who is this Reverend Abel Ansley Jr.? Simply put, he was the favorite son of Jimmy Carter's great-great-grandfather, according to old newspapers put out by the Jimmy Carter campaign shortly after he was elected president. During the election campaign, Jimmy Carter brought a tape recorder to his elderly Uncle Buddy and captured everything he knew about family history. He learned that the Carters had worked the land for centuries and had fought for it just as hard as they'd worked it, from the Patriots to the Gray and the Blue to the European theater and the Pacific. He learned of murders and intrigue and finally traced the Carters' footsteps back to the Quakers on the east coast of the state. It was his Uncle Buddy who took him to the Rock House in 1968, 2 years before he was elected governor, to get in touch with his past. That house had been built by his great-great-great-great-grandfather, Thomas Ansley, and Jimmy Carter's parents are actually buried just next to William Alton Carter, or Uncle Buddy, who helped Jimmy get in touch with his genealogy. I've never actually been to the community of Archery. Now, they say that Jimmy Carter's boyhood home was in Plains, Georgia, but it was actually between Plains and Archery, a little closer to Archery. The Carter family ran a store that was often used by the black residents of Plains because this was an all-black community named after the Knights of Archery, a social fraternal order for black men. Now, this is still lived in, and there's a lot of houses and trailers here that are still connected by dirt roads, and oddly enough, most tour buses that are showing you the historic sites of Plains, Georgia, don't really come down here. I'll pan over the sign so you can read a little bit about it in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is, again, this is one of the areas that Jimmy Carter grew up in and learned to live among these people and love them and went to the same churches with them. It's fascinating to see just how relatable he was, really. And his parents are buried 2 minutes down that road.